You're listening to The First Question with Paul Hendrick, brought to you by Ballistic Sports. Follow Ballistic Sports on Twitter @Ballistic Sports.
Cliff Fletcher's career in hockey began 64 years ago, and he, like many from the Montreal area, including Scotty Bowman, got his start working for the legendary Sam Pollock. He's played key roles in guiding expansion franchises in St. Louis, Atlanta, and he won a Stanley Cup in Calgary. He'd move on to Toronto in 1991 and lead that franchise's run to 2 conference finals. At age 85, Cliff is a senior advisor to the Maple Leafs, a proud grandfather, and a 2004 inductee into the Hockey Hall of Fame. Cliff, Ken Dryden's book on Scotty really hit home for me. Scotty, as you know, grew up in working class Verdun. Describe your neighborhood growing up in Montreal and where along the line you eventually crossed paths with both Scotty and Mr. Pollock.
Well, I grew up more in the northern suburbs, Ville-Saint-Laurent, basically a French-Canadian town, home to Ray Bourque. And Scotty and I first met, really. We both started for Montreal, as I remember it, in 1956. Scotty started off as coach of a team called Park Extension. And I was general manager of the Verdun Blues in the same league, playing against them. And by the way, the captain of my team was Scotty's brother.
Who was a pretty good hockey player in his own right, wasn't he?
Yes, he was, and a very good hockey scout.
You know what was so confusing all those years, and you'd see him in the press box and everybody said, hey, that's Scotty Bowman. I mean, they were identical twins, it seemed like, virtually.
You could tell he was a Bowman.
Yeah, easily done.
That's for sure.
You mentioned Verdun. What do you remember of the old Verdun Auditorium? I know it's been around a long time and has served many purposes, especially during World War II. But as a hockey man, Cliff, what do you recall of that venerable old barn?
Well, back then, 1956, over 60 years ago, I mean, it was in much better shape. I mean, it was a decent building with about six to 7,000 seats, and it was perfect for junior hockey at that time. The province of Quebec was a different setup. In Ontario, you have the OHL. In Quebec, you had the Montreal Junior Canadiens, who were basically the elite of the elite of all the players in the province of Quebec. And then you had the Metropolitan Hockey League, which consisted of 2 teams in Quebec City, 3 Rivers, Shawinigan, and a lot of teams in the Montreal area. That was a level below. You couldn't call it a junior B league because it was a much higher caliber than that, but definitely not on the par with the OHL.
Who were your parents, Cliff? What role might they have played in defining the man you eventually became to be?
Well, my dad originally was a football player. He played for Montreal MAA. He was their quarterback in 1930. That was in the Canadian Football League. And in 1931, he was pushed out as quarterback. Montreal brought in the first American quarterback to ever come into Canada. They brought in Warren Stevens from Syracuse University. And he led them to the Grey Cup that year, and my dad ended up playing wide receiver. And he had a couple more years in football playing, and he ended up as an assistant coach of the McGill football team. So he was always involved in football and in canoe racing.
Did you spend a lot of time around Delormier Stadium back then, following the likes of Lou Heyman's teams? And I think of players like Virgil Wagner, Sam Etcheverry, Hal Patterson, Chuck Hunsinger.
I sure did. As a matter of fact, in 1949, I was only 14 years old, and I bought a season ticket for the Montreal Alouettes. And they had a new American quarterback by the name of Frankie Phillips, and they won the Grey Cup that year. And I really retained my CFL season tickets until I got the job as assistant general manager in St. Louis and moved from Montreal to St. Louis.
Were you a pretty good fastball player in your time?
Well, I wouldn't call it pretty good, but I played, and we used to have a lot of fun playing in tournaments around the province and mostly Montreal area, but I enjoyed playing. And one year, Ronnie Caron and I, God rest his soul, the professor, we were the two-man pitching staff of on a team that went undefeated that year.
Do you recall Sammy Pollock's team, the Snowden Stars, and the crowds they used to attract to games?
Yes, well, Sammy was into the big leagues, Snowden, the fastball league, where most of the teams had 3-4 imports from the U.S., key players like basically pitching and key infielders. So, no, but I met Sam first in the spring of 1956. And, we talked about me possibly joining their management team with under their junior setup. And I was interested, and I got a call back about 2 months later saying, you start in a couple of weeks.
Scouting is getting into the game's trenches. As you know, Cliff, there's the drudgery of cold drinks, bad coffee, and a lot of time spent away from home. But it had to be a necessary rite of passage, don't you think, to get you to where you eventually got yourself later on in your hockey career?
Yes, I mean, Montreal, I joined them just after they had won the first of what would be 5 consecutive Stanley Cups. And the thing that was so prevalent through the organization is continuity and consistency prevailed. There was never any rash decisions based on winning or losing hockey games. And there was a tendency to be very cautious about trading young players when they started their pro career. Everybody had to sign off. You had to be absolutely sure what the long-term potential might be of that player who you're trading. So I think I learned how to run a team and use my patience a little better after having been with them for 10 years.
That run, that dynasty, how good was that 55-56 team? And you think of a line with both Richards and Dickie Moore on it.
Well, they're obviously a great hockey team. I mean, we had Beliveau and Geoffrion, Dickie Moore, the two Richards. 56 was the first year that Henry came in, I think as a 19-year-old. And it was an outstanding hockey team, obviously, and Doug Harvey leading the back end. But, back then it was years before the NHL draft, and in essence, leading right up into the 60s, early 60s, Montreal and Toronto, and to just a lesser extent, but definitely Detroit, had great advantages over the other 3 teams in the league because of control of players in Quebec, Ontario, and Detroit really had a foothold, obviously, out in the prairie provinces.
I grew up in Noranda, Quebec, and I know Jacques Laperriere. He ended up going to Montreal, but Kent Douglas, Dave Keon, I can go on and on. They went to the Toronto Maple Leafs. That little municipality is located 60 miles from the Ontario border. It seemed to be a bit of a hybrid as to what team got them, either Montreal or Toronto, if you recall correctly.
Oh, that's for sure. And well, Jacques Laperriere, one of my first days in the job, I had to go down to the bus terminal and pick him up from his 12-hour bus ride down from Rouen to Montreal to go to school and start off his hockey career.
Yeah, you take the bus from Noranda and you get to Grand Raymond. You get off that bus, you're either going right to Ottawa or left to Montreal, and obviously he ended up in the right spot. We talk about Sam Pollock, Cliff, and as brilliant as he was, how close did he come to giving up on a teenager named Serge Savard before you and Scotty stepped in to try to coerce him the other way?
Well, Sam was influenced by and in the end, he went with us. I mean, obviously, but he was influenced by a gentleman by the name of Armand Mondu, who was president of the Rosemount Junior Hockey Team. And Armand was a former Montreal Canadian player back in the early 40s, I believe. And Armand was the one who suggested that Serge had no chance to ever becoming a hockey player. And he was 15 years old, and he was as big as he is today, and just a gangly kid. But I mean, both Scotty and I knew that this guy was going to be a big time player.
Yeah, won 8 Stanley Cups. You guys did well in that. Scouting, as you know, is an exact science, and the drafting that goes with it. Even the Habs passed on Mike Bossy in 1977 to get to another good hockey player, Mark Napier, who they selected 10th. I mean, sometimes along the way, you do miss out on people who, in Montreal's case, in Bossy, grew up right in their backyard.
Well, I'd left there years before that.
I know.
I wasn't on that watch. I was at St. Louis at that time. I was actually had started my career as general manager in Atlanta when Bossy was drafted by the Islanders.
Yeah, and just how even great players and management and all of this, as I've mentioned, not always an exact science. Let's talk about St. Louis, and expansion comes at a good time for both you and Scotty. Perfect spot, wasn't it, for both you people, with the knowledge you have, the scouting ability that you have to get things started in St. Louis and sell hockey to that community.
And we hired a couple of real good scouts too, Frank Mario and Jimmy Devellano. So we were off to a pretty good start, and they put some restrictions on us. We tried to start because we were hired a year before the expansion division started up in '67. So we tried to establish our own junior hockey team in Quebec, and we're bringing in some pretty good young players, and the league just stepped in, Mr. Campbell, and brought the axe down on us and says, they're not available to you. But no, it was interesting in St. Louis. Scotty took over coaching, I think about 12 games into the season, and we were in last place. And it took to the final weekend of the first season to clinch a playoff spot. And from there, it was great because we won our division that year, played in the Stanley Cup Finals, and actually we won it 3 years in a row.
You guys had a core group of veterans who still had some shelf life in them. Let's start with Dickie Moore and those 2 bad knees of his, but what he was able to bring to that team so late in his career with his body failing him the way it was after such a great career with the Montreal Canadiens.
Yes, I mean, he just brought that leadership, that winning leadership to the team. And boy, Dickie could really stare you down. And when he sat on the bench and stared at one of his teammates, he frightened the hell out of them. And the result usually showed on the ice after that too. But we had a lot of great veterans early on. Ab McDonald, Al Arbor on defense, Jean-Guy Talbot was there. I mean, I could go on, but because the young players weren't available to us, good young players, the 6 existing teams, when they established an expansion, they sort of made it that it would be at least 3 years before we would have access to a pool of young players who had potential.
You mentioned Al Arbor, Cliff, and at that stage in his career, he'd won a couple of Calder's, most recently in Rochester. He'd already won 4 Stanley Cups. He was content to stay in the American Hockey League at this point in his career. And I guess it took, some convincing, your part, Scotty's part, to bring him over in terms of maybe a contract extension. Otherwise, back in those days, same with Johnny Bauer, the American Hockey League was a good place to stay and make a living.
Well, in '67, the first year when we drafted Al in the expansion draft, and he was holding out. And camp had already started in St. Louis, so Al agreed to fly in, and I was the designated chauffeur to pick him up. And he's in the car with me, and he's starting to give me the sales pitch. He said, you know, if I can't get treated fairly in my mind here, then I'll just go back to Sudbury and run a sporting goods store that I have an investment in. I said, Al, when's the last time you were back in Sudbury for a winter? he said about 15 years ago. I said, Al, I've been in Sudbury watching games in the winter. You're not going back there, and you know you're not going back there. He started to laugh, but we got him signed. And what very few people know is he was my first assistant general manager with the Atlanta Flames after he got fired coaching the St. Louis Blues. So we had a great relationship together.
He's been gone for 5 years and we miss him dearly. Goaltending wise, Glenn Hull, 35 years of age, Jacques Plante, 37. How complicated was Jacques when you look back to that stage of his career and still how much he had left in the tank so late?
Well, first of all, the first year, Seth Martin, the Canadian Olympic team goaler, was our backup goaler. And Jacques joined us in year 2, 68, 69. And I mean, we had a pretty good thing going then because we usually kept a third goaler and we respected that their age, both their ages. And when we played back-to-back road games, we would always send the fresh goaler ahead of time to the visiting city and dress up the number 3 goaltender to give them that extra rest. But they basically split a lot of the games, even though Jacques would come up with the odd groin when we were playing in Boston or New York against the Rangers, and Glenn would go in. But when he was in nets, when he played our fellow expansion teams, I mean, if you scored 2 goals, you had a pretty darn good chance to win the game.
Get back to Sam Pollock and his brilliance. I was just looking at Hockey DB, Cliff. Between 1971 and 1974, the Canadians had 13 first-round picks, including 5 alone in the 1974 draft. And I guess this was simply Sam being able to pick off of expansion and saying, hey, we can give you these established players to get you going in your market, but we're going to take your picks. And I mean, Guy Lafleur, I guess for Ralph Backstrom is one of those key stories, but I mean, that era is long gone by. And I see Kyle Dubas and company here in Toronto, and you look around the league, those days will never be back again.
Well, one thing about Sam, he did a better job than any of the other managers at that time in parlaying fringe line assets into futures. And, you know, Montreal had pretty good depth in their farm system, and they were able to move out quite a number of players to the expansion teams who were trying to be competitive because it was an all new sport the cities were going into in most cases. And in return, he would get assets in return that were valuable, especially the first round draft picks. I mean, I was long gone from Montreal, but they had traded for Oakland's first round pick that year, 72, I think it was. I'm not sure. And during the springtime or late winter, LA was starting to fall below Oakland. That Montreal would have lost the first round pick, which would have been first overall. So they traded a pretty darn good hockey player in Ralph Backstrom to LA. So LA started playing better, and that ensured Sam was going to get first pick in the draft, and that turned out to be Guy Lafleur.
Not a bad pick. Your time in Atlanta, how valuable was your experience in St. Louis in terms of getting hockey started in that Georgia hotbed for hockey in Atlanta?
Well, it was the first game of hockey that had ever been played in the state of Georgia. I mean, at any level above amateur. And it was quite an experience. The hockey fans there were really good. And they used to love to come to the rink and drink beer and like goals and like pugilism. And they were good fans. But it was a tough sell in that market because the Flames got more money for their radio rights than they did for television.
Wow.
So that's how tough it was. And the Omni, which was a beautiful building, that they're screwing the seats in the afternoon of our opening home game, was too small. It was 15,000 people, and none of the amenities that went into subsequent buildings going up. It was sort of like the last one of its period and became obsolete very fast. And so consequently, when Tom Cousins had a chance to sell it to Nelson Skalbania for $16 million US, cash in a barrelhead, that was the most money I think a franchise had ever been sold for back then.
How important was it getting Boom Boom Jeffrey in as your first coach? Scotty Bowman described as the ultimate player's coach, but what a personality.
He was by far the most popular sports personality I've ever seen in Atlanta. I mean, the night that Hank Aaron hit 714, the next morning, Boom Boom shared half the front page of the Atlanta papers because that was the morning of our first playoff game ever in our second year in the league. So he was extremely popular.
Players that come to mind, and I had to go down the roster. What do you remember of Bob Leader and his scoring exploits late in his career? But he must have been a bit of a superstar those first couple of years.
Yes, because you have to remember when we came in, we were almost an afterthought, the Islanders and ourselves. And the only reason, as I understood it, that they gave us franchises, and they only granted the franchises in the middle of December of 71. Mm-hmm. And because Atlanta and Long Island had buildings under construction, and they were, the NHL didn't want WHA teams going into those two buildings. So they set it up and in a short period of time, a matter of a couple of weeks, gave franchises to, well, Roy Bowe in Long Island and to the, what was called at that time, the Omni Group in Atlanta. But it was the same year that WHA started up, and the level of talent made available to both the Islanders and ourselves was really minimal. I mean, I think all 20 skaters I drafted in the expansion draft, all 20 of their total career NHL goals was in the 70s. So you can see we weren't going to score goals, but Boomer did a great job, and we had some great veterans. We had Pat Quinn in defense, and Leon Rochford, and you mentioned Bobby Leader, and so and Keith McCreary, who was our first captain. I mean, we were a good checking team, and we got out of the chute. And as a matter of fact, that first year, we were still in the playoff hunt come February.
Do you remember Pat Quinn's legendary goal, I think, coming out of the box down there?
Oh, remember it. My God, I've never seen it. He ruined Rick Hampton's career. I mean, he's lumbering along. I don't even think he's going to make it. Right. And he puts a move on, it drops his shoulder, and Rick Hampton's in the 10th row of the seats. and you know, he was 7th overall draft in the NHL, I think. And then he goes in and Gilles Meloche and dekes him and sticks it top shelf. I mean, Pat could have done it again if he tried it 1,000 times.
You know, ironic, you think of careers basically ending. Pat's ended on his driveway in suburban Atlanta. Do you recall that story?
Oh, very much. We lived close by, and after the first year, he was our captain. Mm-hmm. And yeah, he just had a skateboard accident skateboarding with his daughter, Valerie. Uh-huh. And that basically was the end of his playing career. And then after that, he got a job to coach the Philadelphia Flyers and moved up there and then went to Springfield, coach American League team.
he and Sandra, all over Hell's Half Acre in North America. Your hockey allegiances, Cliff, are many. How special was Al McNeil, given all he accomplished as a player, coach, and general manager along the line with you?
Oh, I couldn't express into words properly how much he meant to me. I mean, what a great friend, an outstanding hockey man, won the Stanley Cup coaching the Montreal Canadiens, had a tremendous record developing players for the Canadiens in Halifax, and came to us as coach for a couple of years. And then I thought he was too valuable. We brought him. I wanted him to come and sit beside me in the front office because we had a lot of work to do when we moved from Atlanta to Calgary.
He wins a Stanley Cup with Montreal in '71, and a year later wins a Calder Cup in Nova Scotia. And I know there was a little discrepancy, I think, with Henri Richard back then. I don't know if you're going to see that ever happen again, winning at the top level and then going back the following year and winning in the American Hockey League. I mean, that was a head scratcher.
It was a head scratcher, and I'm sure he never really talked about it much to me, but Halifax, Nova Scotia was home, so that sort of deadened the blunt of the blow considerably.
Doug Gilmour credits Jacques Demers for his role, making him a better player defensively, especially in those early years in St. Louis. Go back in your relationship with Jacques, and I guess it goes back to St. Louis, I think, and eventually to Tampa, of course.
No, what happened was Jacques came into St. Louis after I was in Atlanta. Mm-hmm. And so, no, we didn't cross paths there at all. First time we crossed paths when he called me, and I was out of work then, and after being let go by the Maple Leafs, and we were living in Longboat Key, Florida, which is only 50 miles from the rink where they played hockey initially, in the ballpark in St. Petersburg. And Jacques called and said, they just named me general manager. He says, I have no clue what I'm doing. Do you want to come with me? So I was happy to join him. And I said, Jacques, just, give me a contract just for the rest of the year. We'll worry about next year. He says, no, Cliff. Pension plan, 3-year contract. He was a character, but he was a good coach. Jacques was a very good coach.
The Cup in 1989 in Calgary, was it a direct result, do you think, of losing to Montreal in '86 and all those tough losses head-to-head with Edmonton, do you think? I mean, did the Flames have to lose to learn how to win eventually, do you think?
Well, that's pretty well what people say. But whether or not, what happened in '86, unfortunately, is that the games, not like today, where all the series are scheduled around television, and there's more off days than there were back then. I mean, we played every second day, and the only time you ever got an off day is if the series ended before Game 7. And when we played Edmonton, we went 7 games. Then we played St. Louis, and we were up 3-2 in Game 6, but got beaten in St. Louis. And they came back, and we played Game 7 on a Sunday afternoon in Calgary, and we started the Stanley Cup Finals Tuesday night. But I found that during the Stanley Cup Finals, Badger Bob was coaching, and he was really trying to motivate them. And the players, they were all saying the right things. And we won the first game, and then Montreal scored 6 seconds into overtime to tie the series. And after that, Montreal won 3 straight. But our players were mentally fatigued. The emotions of beating Edmonton in Game 7 in Edmonton and going through all that and another 7-game series, they just didn't have any more gas in the tank. As much as they wanted it, they didn't. But 89, we were a little fortunate. I mean, we won the President's Trophy in '88 and lost out second round of the playoffs. So '89 we win the President's Trophy again. We're playing the Vancouver Canucks, and we led them by 43 points or 42 or 44 during the regular season. And we're in game 7 fighting for our lives. I mean, our team was so uptight. And we shoveled a goal in late in overtime that Reed Mitchell will tell you shouldn't have counted, but I just said, well, geez, I just read the book. We won the series. But after that, we got fortunate. We shoveled a goal in overtime. And after that, our team just relaxed, started to play the hockey they had played all year. And we only lost 3 games the last 3 series.
You win the cup in your hometown, Montreal, and defeat the Canadiens for a championship in their building for the first time Montreal had ever lost in 68 years on home ice. I mean, symbolically, it had to mean so much.
Yes, it was quite a feeling. I mean, the fact that no one had ever won there before, really, I didn't realize that at the time, or it didn't in any way influence me. But just the fact that we were able to beat them in game 6 there and win the series on Forum ice, which I always respected for what it represented over the years and years of great hockey and great hockey teams. And it was just a feeling that you can't describe. You can't describe.
Not everybody can play. There are aces. And in that game in Montreal, veterans Tim Hunter and Jim Poplinski watched the game on bikes in the dressing room, but there they were afterwards to celebrate. I mean, the ultimate consummate professionals, both those guys.
Well, the hard part is the very hard part there. And against Chicago, Hunter, both Timmy and Pepe were key players for us. They had to do all our fighting. And I mean, it was a fist-filled, tough series. And boy, they sure were more than responsible for us going into the Stanley Cup finals. But playing Montreal was a totally different team. It was a team that you weren't going to get many physical confrontations. It was a team that really had speed. So if you're going to play them, you better have a speed lineup. And that's what our coaches decided to do, and how we had a wealth of extra players and NHL players on our roster. There was no limit back then. There was no cap system. So we had great depth. And we played players like Yuri Hrdina, who had great speed. And the day of game 6, the coaches were meeting. And there was 3 players that were only one of them was going to play that game that night. And it was the 2 you just mentioned, plus Lanny.
Yeah.
And so they were going back and forth. I mean, they were having a hard time living with this. Only one of them could dress. And I kept out of it. I sat in the background and watched them. And finally, Tom Watts stood up. He says, look, guys, if we win the cup tonight, there's only one player of those 3 that's going to be in the Hall of Fame. He's the one that should dress. So Lanny dressed, came and scored that big goal for us. And he was there to celebrate winning the cup. Great way to end a wonderful career, Hall of Fame career.
1991, you come to Toronto. You make a legendary 10-player trade. Of course, we all know that brings Doug Gilmour. And as important as Dougie was coming, maybe possibly your greatest hire was Pat Burns as head coach. What kind of respect did he command, not only behind the bench, but on the ice, especially when it came time to talking to that team that was just about to turn the corner?
Well, Pat was one tough hombre. And, he was coming from the Montreal Canadiens, quote unquote. I mean, he was legendary for that. And I mean, he gained immediate respect. And, he had the benefit of starting off that year and with Doug Gilmour, who we had acquired January 1st or 2nd just before. And then we were meeting in the office, during the off season. He says, Cliff, why don't you make a deal with Montreal for Sylvain Lefebvre? I said, Pat, you don't even like him. You didn't dress him in the playoffs. And he said, Cliff, I'll play him here. He'll help. So I was able to make a trade with Montreal because they felt he was an extra for them. And he came and played very, very well for us right off the bat, under Pat. But, Pat turned the team around. We were very tough to play against defensively. And he was fortunate enough to have Wendell and Dougie to build on. And then halfway through that year, we got Dave Anderchuk. So that was just icing on the cake.
Was it you or Pat who denied Dougie his motorcycle?
No, that was between Pat and Dougie.
Okay.
I know for sure that they went on a few motorcycle trips together.
No doubt. 93 playoffs, you're in Detroit, down 2-0, outscored 12-5, off day, Maple Leaf Gardens. You, if I recall, under the stories, addressed the hockey club, didn't you? I don't know how comfortable Pat was with that, but obviously talking to some of the players, it was a very inspirational talk, and it grounded everything, knowing that what the Leafs had to do in terms of winning 4 out of the next 5 games.
Well, we weren't even looking at winning 4. We were just looking at winning that first one to start off. And we had such a great year during the regular season. The best year a Leaf team had for a decade. And I said, let's not throw this out the window. We've shown people we're a good hockey team. Now let's just get out there and prove it against Detroit. And we were able to win game 3 and 4 at home. And obviously the big win was game 5 in Detroit. And then we're coming home for game 6 and planning the Stanley Cup parade. And everybody's, the series is over tonight. Well, they only beat us, 7-2 or something? And could have been 10-2. Mm-hmm. It was a totally one-sided game. But game 7 is history. We were able to get it to overtime, and our shot went in.
Bob Rouse from the point. You mentioned, Sly. There was Cooner. I can go on and on. Davey Ellett. The toughness of Bob Rouse and all those other attributes he brought to his game, and he'd eventually go on to win cups beyond that in Detroit. But what an impact he had in just getting the puck to the net. And obviously Nicky was there to redirect it.
Well, he was a pillar on defense for us, that's for sure, and a key member. But also we had a pair of Natras and McCowan who had won a cup in '89 in Calgary. They were good pressure playoff defensemen, and they played very well together for us that whole year and in that series. But one of the biggest disappointments in hockey is when Bob went to Detroit the next year as a free agent. We wanted to sign him, but it just couldn't be worked out. He basically wanted to go to Detroit, and we missed him.
A few more questions, but one more, just on 93 in that spring. Was that the best hockey Wendell ever played, do you think, in his career?
Oh, he played great, but he played so well throughout his career. If you remember when we traded him to Quebec for Matt Sundin, I knew Wendell was the heart and soul of the Leaf team. I knew what he meant to fans in the city through all the hard years. He was their one beacon of light, their hope. And I really didn't want to trade him at all, but I don't know how you turn a trade down for a 23-year-old centerman who's a stud, doesn't miss a game, and scores in the high 40s in goals. So there was a deal that had to be made, but I couldn't wait to get him back. Not much more than a year later, because the year we traded him, we didn't start playing to January. It was only half a year. And then we brought him back the following February. And the year after we brought him back, Wendell had a 30-goal season. he was terrific that year. So one of the greatest hockey players the Maple Leafs have ever had, Wendell Clark.
I remember the buzz at the Gardens when I think it was Dallas was in town that night. Oh my God, it was just incredible. And obviously there's a reason why Wendell's on Legends Row. Let's go to mid-90s. How close did you come to getting Wayne Gretzky to Toronto, Cliff?
Well, it was definitely in the stages where there was interest, definite interest. Mm-hmm. You know, Wayne's dad was recovering, and Toronto's close to Brantford, and I think that was a motivating factor for him. But financially, it just couldn't be worked out. It didn't make sense to our board of directors at that time. So, and also we still had Gilmore and Sundin at center. So it was something that I had to move on from.
We're going to move on in just a moment. And totally enjoyed the work your son Chuck has done. When did he get the hockey executive bug when you look back to him growing up?
Well, you know, like all hockey people, Doobie today spends as much time with his son Leo as he can. And we traveled so much back then. And the kids, we weren't around for a lot of their growing up. So whenever I was home, I always brought Chuck with me. He would sit there when he was a very young age, when we were discussing trades, when we were at meetings. I mean, he was around the team all the time. He grew up in a hockey atmosphere, seeing NHL, what it's like living in an NHL household when, you know, you have highs and you have lows, you have winning streaks and you have losing streaks, and how you react to them. So I try to keep him close to me the whole time.
Well, to quote Ken Dryden's description of Scotty Bowman, and it's a description that applies to this gentleman as well, not a man who lives in the past, it's always how the present will get him to the future. That is Cliff Fletcher. Cliff, happy belated 85th, and thanks for doing this.
My pleasure, Paul. You take care, and hopefully we'll be back on the ice shortly.
You're listening to The First Question with Paul Hendrick, brought to you by Ballistic Sports. Follow Ballistic Sports on Twitter @Ballistic Sports.